Initiating the English opening immediately contests the d5 square, creating early structural asymmetry and aiming for a flexible queenside expansion. This flexible development prepares to contest the center and hints at a variety of opening systems. Solidifying the center and preparing for pawn advances, it fosters flexible development for white. Opening the path for the queen and bishop, black solidifies the center, setting up a solid yet flexible pawn structure. Solidifying the center and preparing for kingside castling, this develops a piece harmoniously. Unlocking the center with the pawn immediately creates dynamic possibilities, challenging white's central pawn structure and opening diagonal lines for development. Challenging black's central foothold, this pawn push immediately escalates the positional struggle for initiative. Shattering the central pawn structure immediately seizes the initiative and forces white into sharp tactical calculations. Opening the center here creates dynamic play and immediate tactical possibilities. Reclaiming the pawn solidifies black's central presence and opens lines for active piece development. Solidifying the center and preparing development, this move aims for a harmonious setup while keeping options open. Developing the bishop to a natural square, preparing to castle and complete kingside harmony. Developing the bishop to a more active diagonal opens lines for potential kingside attacks and supports the central pawn structure. Exchanging pawns opens the center, potentially creating dynamic piece play and simplifying into a more open structure. Opens a diagonal for the queen and prepares to contest central space. Prepares to develop the queenside bishop, eyeing a harmonious setup and potentially controlling the long diagonal. Swapping knights clears the way for potential piece activity and aims to simplify into a favorable structure. Opening the queen to a central outpost, this repositions the monarch's defender aggressively. Safely tucking the monarch away opens up lines for queenside expansion and pawn pressure. Developing the knight to d7 subtly reinforces the pawn chain and prepares for future queenside expansion. Opening the e-file offers a crucial pathway for the rook, potentially targeting black's undeveloped queenside and adding pressure to the center. Re-establishing piece mobility, this knight begins its journey to potentially contest central squares or aid queenside defense. Unpinning the knight opens the bishop to eye potential squares on the kingside, while simultaneously reinforcing central control and preparing for future queenside development. Developing the bishop to this square prepares for active queenside pressure and aims to bolster the king's defense. Exchanging the bishop clears the d-file, creating potential pressure and a pawn structure advantage for white. Trading the bishop for the knight eliminates black's central defender, opening lines for white's rooks and potentially compromising black's king's safety. Challenging the bishop's influence, this square opens lines for immediate central pressure. Repositioning the queen to d7 reclaims the center control after white's bishop trade and prepares for potential pawn advances. Pawn thrust opens diagonals, challenging black's queenside structure and forcing a decision on the central tension. Centralizing the rook on the open file pressures white's central pawn and prepares to contest the crucial d-file. Centralizing the queen here prepares for potential queenside expansion and supports a future central push, a sound plan to increase pressure. Sacrificing tempo for a pawn, this exchange opens lines but risks white's central pawn majority. Exchanging on d5 clarifies the pawn structure, opening lines for black's remaining pieces to find active squares. Reclaiming the central pawn reopens crucial diagonal lines, forcing white to defend their exposed king. Opening the red file now allows white to exert pressure on the d-pawn and prepare for a central pawn push. Shifting the queen to the queenside aims to avoid further pawn exchanges and potentially prepare a queenside play. Clearing the d-file to force a queen trade significantly simplifies the position, leading towards an endgame where your rook activity will be paramount. Opening the d-file for your rook solidifies control and pressures the queenside pieces. Reclaiming the open d-file solidifies white's central influence and prepares for pressure against black's king. The bishop now aims to reroute, seeking active squares or potentially supporting a pawn push later. Unveiling an unexpected royal check, this maneuver forces an immediate response, disrupting black's defensive setup and potentially isolating the king. Sacrificing a pawn here gambles on disrupting white's queenside pawn structure for activity. Sensing a shift towards simplification, this offers a queen trade to gain a slight initiative in the subsequent simplified position. This pawn push creates a crucial bottleneck, forcing black to choose between immediate tactical concessions and long-term positional weakness. Targeting that advanced d, pawn opens up critical defensive lines for black. A vital castle to secure the king's safety amidst the escalating positional battle and potential for pawn structure weaknesses. Pressing the knight forward aggressively probes for weaknesses and aims to disrupt black's pawn structure. Initiating a daring pawn push on the queenside to break open lines and challenge white's central dominance. Securing the king and preparing a potential pawn storm on the kingside. Asserting queenside pressure and threatening the rook, solidifies black's influence. Simplifying to a favorable endgame, clearing the queenside while preparing to exploit the open files. The capture opens a critical file for your rook, but it also creates weaknesses on the queenside. Asserting control over the crucial 7th rank, this rook advances to dominate the open file. Focusing on king safety now, the monarch retreats to the center of the board, preparing to support the advancing pawns. Clearing a path for the king to rejoin the fray, reinforcing the center and preparing for a potential pawn push. Unleashing the rook to the 1st rank injects immediate pressure, targeting the white king's slightly exposed position. Relocating the monarch to a safer sector seems prudent given the open diagonal. Aggressively forcing a king shuffle now aims to exploit weaknesses created by the pawn structure exchange. Securing the 7th rank with the rook establishes a crucial foothold, aiming to penetrate black's defenses along that open file. Conceding the open file now simplifies into a bishop versus rook endgame, where white must be vigilant about potential pawn breaks. A pivotal moment. The king's re-entry into the fray now shapes the endgame's intricate dance for peace activity. Activating the bishop to a more influential square promises counterplay in this endgame. Solidifying the pawn chain offers a slight improvement in pawn structure and begins preparing for potential pawn advances later. Excellent centralization. This bishop now exerts pressure on white's kingside, potentially targeting weaknesses and limiting the white king's mobility in the coming endgame. Knight repositions to dominate the d-file, creating potential for future infiltration and bolstering control over central squares. Shifting the king's focus towards the center offers better protection and readies it for potential pawn races. Bolstering the king's shield with an extra pawn provides a vital defensive anchor against future incursions. Prioritizing the central control and preparing for pawn advances, this placement aims to solidify the king's safety. Restoring knight mobility opens avenues for central influence and potential pawn breakthroughs. Pushing the pawn creates dynamic possibilities, potentially opening the f-file for counterplay. Consolidating the monarch's position initiates a potential pawn break with f4, aiming for more active king engagement. Positioning the bishop here aims to contest the d-file and restrict white's central pawns, a vital endgame maneuver. Repositioning the knight to a more active square, preparing to challenge the bishop's influence. The black king boldly marches forward, seeking active participation in this endgame, but risks isolation. Shifting the king back to d2 prepares for a potential king hunt if black's pieces advance too aggressively. Pushing the g-pawn here is an ambitious attempt to gain queenside space, but it might overextend the pawn structure and weaken the king's shelter later. Reclaiming central influence with the king is a smart regrouping, preparing for potential pawn advances. The king ventures out, seeking active participation, but its central placement on d5 creates a target. A desperate attempt to disrupt black's king's safety and open lines, but it overextends the knight and may prove futile. A bold king march, seeking active post, but potentially exposes the monarch to open lines. Repositioning the knight to control central squares and prepare for pawn advances. Reclaiming central space allows the king to re-engage and exploit the slightly passive knight. Pivoting the knight to b4 aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially create outposts. Introducing a passed pawn to the kingside aims to disrupt white's queenside pawn structure. Preparing to regroup the monarch to the relative safety of the queenside wing. Shifting the bishop here aims to reposition it for potential defensive support or to simply wait for a more opportune moment to engage. Repositioning the knight to d3 aims to challenge black's central pawn majority and prepare a potential advance of the b-pawn. Pushing the pawn here is a bold attempt to create space on the kingside, potentially forcing a reaction from white's pieces. Reclaiming the central square offers an avenue to activate the knight and contest control of the key d4 outpost. This retreat re-establishes the bishop's influence on the queenside, preparing to support the central pawn push. Repositioning the knight to a more active square, controlling key central squares and preparing to support an eventual pawn advance. A bold attempt to seize queenside space, but it neglects central pawn weaknesses. Relocating the king seeks a safer square amidst the passed pawn threat, while also preparing to support its knight. Confronting the central pawn structure, the black king boldly marches forward to claim a more active square. Repositioning the knight to flank the enemy pawn chain creates pressure and prepares for further advances on the kingside. A vital pawn advances, claiming central space and preparing to support the bishop's new outpost. Reinforcing the king's central safety becomes paramount now, anticipating further pawn advances. Initiating pawn advances to potentially break open lines and create activity on the kingside. Sacrificing the pawn opens lines, aiming to exploit the black king's exposed position. Capturing that pawn opens up the king, potentially creating weaknesses that will need vigilant defense in the coming exchanges. Knights find a stable square, ready to support the central pawn push and disrupt black's space advantage. The bishop retreats to d6, aiming to reposition and support the pawn push, a subtle maneuver in this endgame. King's purposeful advance to centralize and contest control of key squares. This knight repositions to contest the central squares and prepare for further pawn advances. Repositioning the knight to e1 aims to redeploy it to more active squares and potentially support a pawn push. Unlocking the kingside pawn structure opens crucial attacking avenues. A decisive fork, threatening to dismantle black's pawn chain and seize control of the center. The knight's retreat to e4 unchains the pawn on d4, creating immediate central penetration opportunities. Asserting control over the central squares with the knight, aiming to restrict black's advanced pawns and prepare for a potential kingside advance. Opening the g-file offers counterplay, but risks exposing your king further if white can create threats. Capturing the pawn opens the g-file, potentially exposing black's king and creating attacking chances. Unleashing the pawn storm with this aggressive push, black aims to break through white's king's defenses. Repositioning the knight to f1 aims to reinforce the kingside defense and potentially prepare a kingside pawn advance. Unleashing a desperate pawn push, black aims to disrupt white's well-placed knight and create attacking chances before a likely king capture. Initiating a desperate counterattack by sacrificing king's safety for potential pawn breakthroughs. Unveiling a desperate attempt to disrupt the enemy monarch's safety through an unexpected check. Committing the king to the center invites immediate danger, leaving it exposed to discovered attacks and forking opportunities. A subtle pawn advance, seeking to expand space on the queenside, though it might overextend if not properly supported. Initiating a king hunt to consolidate gains after black's desperate pawn thrust. The black king bravely advances, seeking to exploit the weakened queenside pawn structure and launch a final push. King repositioning to a safer square, preparing for further pawn advances or defensive maneuvers. Exposing the king's defenses with this discovered check grants material advantage by forcing the king away from its protective pawns. The king seeks refuge, shuffling away from the immediate onslaught of black's bishop and knight. Unleashing the passed pawn on the f-file is the ultimate goal now, aiming to disrupt white's defensive structure.